May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So, I want you to imagine that you're at a buffet, and after finishing your last plate, you duck into the bathroom before going home. And as you're washing your hands, someone comes out of a stall and exits the restroom. Gross, you find yourself thinking. Who doesn't wash their hands after using the facilities? Have they never heard that cleanliness is next to godliness? But as you leave the restaurant, you see that same person in line at the buffet, and your revulsion turns to horror. You can't help but imagine the germs and filth passing from that person's hands into the food that other people are going to eat. And as you might have guessed, this morning's gospel is that rare time when my gut reaction is to agree with the Pharisees, because eating without washing your hands is just icky. While going from village to village, healing the sick, Jesus and his disciples have paused for a meal and have been joined by a group of Pharisees and scribes who came from Jerusalem to investigate reports that a Galilean teacher ate with tax collectors and ignored the Sabbath regulations. So they're trying to find out if Jesus is indeed flaunting the law. And the first thing that they see is his disciples eating without having washed their hands. Now, eating without having washed your hands is not against the law, but it was against the tradition as taught at the time. Because Exodus tells us that priests must wash their hands before ministering at the altar. And eating meat after a sacrifice was considered part of a priest's ministry. And because Exodus also calls all of Israel to be a kingdom of priests, the tradition then said that all the people should wash their hands before eating. And logically, that's a bit of a stretch, but it makes a lot of sense if we guess that even though they knew nothing of germs, some of our ancestors probably did share our visceral revulsion at the prospect of touching food with dirty hands. And given that Jesus was in the habit of inviting strangers to eat with him, this group of Pharisees and scribes had to wonder if they were soon going to be asked to share the bread that the disciples had broken with their filthy hands. But when the Pharisees object to the disciples' behavior, they don't ask, Jesus, why don't your followers wash their hands? It's gross, which runs the risk of making them sound childish. Instead of focusing on that physical uncleanness of the disciples' hands, the Pharisees choose to frame their question in terms of ritual uncleanness. Because unlike modern times, where sanitation laws and health inspections protect our food from ickiness without having to bring God into it, in ancient Galilee, there was only the law about ritual purity and defilement, those rules about when people were clean or unclean, and thus could or could not worship in the temple. And the only way that the Pharisees could talk with any authority about the disciples' dirty hands was to cite that tradition of the elders, that eating without washing your hands defiles you in God's eyes. And the Pharisees thus seemed to be going after Jesus for his perceived failures to live according to the law, rather than just aiming at the disciples' gross behavior. And so when they do that, Jesus pounces. The law potentially confuses physical uncleanness that keeps a person from entering the temple with spiritual defilement that distances a person from God. And Jesus says that in focusing on the tradition, the Pharisees are confusing human precepts for divine doctrines, mixing up human concerns about cleanliness with divine concerns about sin. Washing your hands might make you clean in the eyes of other people, but eating with dirty hands does not defile a person before God. Failing to wash your hands does not make you inherently sinful or unholy. No tradition about physical cleanness, however carefully observed, can touch the real problem of the human condition, a defiled heart. Humans see gross uncleanness in unwashed hands, or in uncontrolled discharges from one's nethers, or in eating pork because pigs wallow ickily in the mud. But God sees gross uncleanness in acting according to evil intentions. The real defilement that everyone should be worrying about is their own evil behaviors. And not just the obvious murder, theft, adultery, and lying, but also any action that's taken out of envy of another, or excessive pride in one's abilities, or just plain foolishness. These are the things that really do hinder our relationship with God. In obsessing over the disciples' physical uncleanness, the Pharisees are themselves exhibiting the defilement of their proud hearts. And this has profound implications for all the followers of Jesus. According to Mark, it's this teaching that frees Christians from observing the details of the law, thereby allowing us to eat bacon, or making it okay for a priest to visit the sick and celebrate communion in the same weekend. This teaching also discourages us from making our own spiritual laws around cleanliness. For example, we cannot say that God demands that we wear certain attire for worship. And we wash our hands to prevent the spread of disease, not because we've decided that God doesn't want us in church if we don't. But this teaching also challenges us to separate our physical revulsion from our moral discernment, to never equate grossness with spiritual defilement, despite nearly 2 millennia of Christians often doing exactly that. But no matter how dirty or stinky a homeless person is, we must never imagine that God does not love them. No matter how icky a person's illness, we must never imagine their sickness as God's punishment. And specifically for men, no matter how gross we might find menstruation, we must never imagine that women bleed because God hates them or made them inferior. And conversely, this teaching also urges us not to equate physical cleanliness with spiritual purity. As we are regularly reminded in our public life, people who are well-groomed and well-dressed in the cleanest of clothes and who seem blessed with health and wealth are nonetheless often defiled by their own adultery and deceit and folly. We must not do as the Pharisees did and confuse physical ickiness with moral defilement. That person in the buffet line is gross because they're spreading germs and filth, not because they're a wretched sinner unworthy to set foot in church. Those who will not get vaccinated are a problem because they're failing to care for their own health and for the health of their neighbors, not because they're evil people who are bound for hell. In Jesus, God has given us a remarkable gift, freeing us from our concern that failing to adhere to the details of the law is a moral failing on our part, and rather redirecting our attention to the true defilement that comes not from outside our bodies, but from within. Because those things that defile us from within, God can help us to identify them and confess them and heal them before they emerge to harm others. Because according to Jesus, what comes next to godliness is not cleanliness, but refraining from evil, and instead acting out of the love that God grafts into our hearts. Amen.